Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the previous reading guide 4, we examined how economic theories can only be understood within their historical context. In this supplementary talk, we will look at how economic systems have evolved over time, and correspondingly, the economic theories that goes with the system has also changed with time. So today, actually, all over the world, we are living in what's called global capitalism. All of the countries in the world have roughly the same system. This is a new development. It wasn't like this earlier. Multiple types of systems were in operation until very recently. Uh, but today we have the false impression that there's only one economic system. And actually, this is the system that is discussed or studied in modern economic theory. So if we want to break out of this tunnel vision, there are two methods. One is to look at the vast number of different varieties of capitalism and also how it has been continuously changing even in front of our eyes. And the other is to study how the economic systems have evolved and changed over time, sometimes very radical ways. So in this particular set of slides, I'm going to look at only the historical change. The other kind will be referenced. So what do we get from studying the evolution of economic systems? We want to show that economic systems can change, sometimes radically. How do these changes happen? Well, there can be external forces, something outside, or some internal dynamics of the system which leads to change. When we look at these changes, it's not that these changes are unexpected or unpredictable. Rather, the change process follows certain patterns and rules which can be discussed and studied and understood in a causal way. Economic theories arise to understand the systems, but these theories develop with lags. As a result, the policies which are based on theories adapted to previous systems may be applied, sometimes with disastrous results, to a changed system. Final insight that we want to get from this study of the evolution of economic systems is that economics is not isolated from politics, society, environment. All of these dimensions of our lives evolve together and they influence each other. So we'll briefly cover early history. The mankind spent the greatest portion of history in tribal societies where cooperation was necessary for survival. So in fact, cooperation has been built into our nature, contrary to what economic theory tells us, that we are competitive and selfish. This is not true, actually. In the vast majority of our history, it has been the other way. It started out with hunter-gatherer societies which were nomadic, and so property did not mean much. Also, they were egalitarian societies because everyone had to hunt for a living. Also, if one hunter brought in the food, he would want to share it with others, because when others brought in, they would also share. Otherwise, if everyone hoarded, first of all, it would be too much for one person. Also, it would have harmful effects on the society as a whole. So all of these things, the economic system governs or affects the social system. Then there was an agricultural revolution, which led to an agricultural society. In the agricultural society, you have to harvest what you plant, and that leads to the idea of private property. Eventually, in the agricultural society, there were still some hunters who were the warrior class, and there were the peasants who were the farming class, and together this mix created the feudal societies all over the world. And later, when some of these warlords became strong, they created city-states. So All of these were radical transitions in the economic systems, and these were transitions which took place in all fronts, in the politics, in the society, in the environment. And so all of these changes were connected to each other, and we can't study any one system like the economic system in isolation from politics and society and environment. Most important for understanding the origins of capitalism is to study the great transformation which took place in Europe. Again, we are going to skim very briefly through this, and there is a huge amount of literature, libraries of books devoted to the study. But it was a combination of accidents which led to the Industrial Revolution in England. There was no one reason. There were multiple causes which all combined together. So the Industrial Revolution created the possibility of massive surplus production, and this single fact drove a whole lot of changes in society and politics and institutions. And we just list briefly these changes, and we cover these, and all of these changes went into the creation of the modern capitalist system. So the first problem when you start producing surplus is, what will you do with the surplus? In traditional societies all over the world, self-sufficiency was a value. And so basically, in economic theory, the Say's law, which says that if you produce something, it will automatically find consumers. This actually reflects the anxiety created by the Industrial Revolution, that we are going to produce huge amounts of surplus stuff. What are we going to do with it? So Say says that you can, if you have surplus, you can always find consumers for it. But basically, this led to the Industrial Revolution, led to the creation of a consumer society. Domestically, people started enjoying so-called higher standards of living, but this was not sufficient to handle the amount of production. So the attention of the industrial society turned to the rest of the world. And there was an attempt by England to trade with Europe, but also the efforts to trade across the world, and ultimately this led to these trade efforts failed because the European goods were not valued by self-sufficient societies. They had everything they need. Of course, you can trade for trifles, but this is not going to be sufficient for large-scale trade that was needed. The Industrial Revolution also provided the capacity for production of weapons, and this led to the conquest. Fairly brutal process of colonization was necessary because the colonization needed to destroy the self-sufficient societies in order to create dependent societies which would buy products. The theory of comparative advantage was invented to teach us that colonies must produce raw materials and sell them to the colonizer, and then buy manufactured products from colonizer, instead of the more natural setup where you produce the raw materials and you manufacture, and then you sell them to whoever you want to. Another change created by the Industrial Revolution was the creation of a labor force. Large-scale production requires a large labor force. So portions of humans' lives were put for sale. This actually cheapened the natural value of human lives and reduces us to human resources. It creates the false idea that the worth of our lives, the worth of human lives, can be measured by money. And it also required weakening of social forces of compassion, responsibility, because if we are going to hire laborers, and our interest as a capitalist is to give them a low wage, so we cannot afford to be sympathetic to the poor. If we provide food for the poor, they will not work in our factories. So these forces of social responsibility are weakened, and also the competitive ideas that everyone, it's a jungle, everyone for himself, let the other person starve if he can't provide for himself. and our goal in life is to seek pleasure only for ourselves. All of these ideas were strengthened by the uh, Industrial Revolution. Money became centrally important because when you create surplus, you can't really store the goods. They are not of much use. You can sell them and store the money. The money is the best way to store value. Money became the measure of the worth of all things, commodities and human lives and many other things. So because of this change, money became the marker of social status. People started to seek money for its own sake. And this led to a transition from the pre-market society CMC prime mode, which means that we produce commodities and we trade them for other commodities, and maybe we use money as an intermediate process. That is, we can sell some commodities to get money in order to buy some other commodities that we need. But basically, this is a kind of a barter society where barter is facilitated by money, and the goal of life is the consumption of commodities. As opposed to this, in a capitalist society, money is the goal. So we use money to produce commodities and we sell these commodities to get more money. So money, this mode of production is radically different from the traditional mode. Another consequence of industrialization was that land also became a factor of production. Normally, we have a symbiotic relationship with Mother Earth. It feeds us, clothes us, houses us, and we protect it and preserve it and enhance it. But when land becomes a commodity for sale, then it becomes cheap. The Amazon forest, instead of looking at it as the wonder of the world, we look at it as a source of timber to make furniture. Capitalism itself has changed radically over time. There are many varieties of capitalism. Some have been very successful, some have been failure. There have been major changes over the 20th century. Initially, capitalists were small and there were small ventures. Later on, as time progressed, people learned how to make large investments. And in the most recent phase is called money manager capitalism, because vast amounts of money in pensions and in investment funds are sitting in the hands of people who don't own this capital, and the goal of the money manager is to get maximum returns out of this capital. This has had a dramatic effect on the way capital is used. So each of these phases has its own characteristic strengths and weaknesses and social and political impact.